So for my video of choice for the honors project, I chose to do Huntington's disease, and I chose to do this disease, basically a book I was reading called 5 Days Left was about the main character who actually had Huntington's disease, and I was really curious as to what exactly this disease is and how it affects the brain. I really wanted to know more about this disease. So in my video, we're talking about an overview of it, what happens to the brain, some symptoms and causes, and speech and language problems that arise because of Huntington's disease. So an overview of the disease. So what exactly is Huntington's disease? Huntington's disease is an autosomal dominant progressive neurodegenerative disorder. So to break that down, autosomal dominant means it's a pattern of inheritance in which the affected person has one copy of the mutant gene and one of the normal gene. Progressive means it gets worse with time, and neurodegenerative means it destroys the neurons that are found in your brain. It's also a hereditary disorder, so it's highly likely that if somebody in your family has this disease that you will develop it. Another part of this disease is CAG repeat, and CAG is made up of cytosine, adenine, and guanine. This appears multiple times in a row within a gene, and 10 to 35 repetitions is what a normal person has inside their brain. 36 to 39 repetitions, you're at risk for developing some of those symptoms of Huntington's disease, and 40 plus repetitions, there is a good chance that you will develop this disease. Another part of Huntington's disease is Huntington protein, and those long segments that we just talked about of CAG repeat, they produce long segments of Huntington protein. And those long segments are then mutated Huntington protein, and they are cut into smaller and toxic segments, and those will bind and develop onto neurons. And then dysfunction and death of the neurons affected by the Huntington protein in areas of the brain, that is what leads to the signs and symptoms of Huntington's disease. Alright, so what exactly happens to the brain when somebody has Huntington's disease? The two main areas of the brain that are affected are the basal ganglia and the cerebellum. So first with the basal ganglia, it's going to experience changes in the cannabinoid, dopamine, and adenosine receptors in the basal ganglia. The cannabinoid receptor is presynaptically localized on striategral and striopalatal terminals of the substena nigra and globus pallidus. There's high densities of the cannabinoid receptor binding sites in the globus pallidus, and dopamine is normally homogeneously distributed in the caudate nucleus and pituitary. And then when somebody has Huntington's disease, there's a major loss in the dopamine. For the cerebellum, that will experience loss of Purkinje cells and nerve cells in the fascicle, globus, umbiliform, and dentate nuclei. And those Purkinje cells, they release the neurotransmitter called GABA, which ultimately reduces transmission of nerve impulses. Those surviving Purkinje cells, they're typically ballooned, and they have torpedo-like inclusions on the axons of them. The cerebellum itself can experience atrophy, and then the degeneration of cerebellum might lead to those causes of Huntington's disease like the chorea, dysarthria, ataxia, postural instability, and gait and stance imbalance. All right, so what happens because of the disease to the rest of the body? So we'll talk about physical, cognitive, and behavioral aspects. So as far as physical goes, somebody can experience chorea, which is involuntary muscle movement or jerking. They also have dystonia, which is uncontrollable muscle contractions, incoordination, posture problems, inflexibility, and walking problems. As far as cognitive things go, you can have difficulty planning and organizing, especially if you were good at that before you had the disease, lack of initiation, irritability, unawareness of especially of things around you, difficulty learning new material, and impulsivity. And some behavioral symptoms, you can experience depression and anxiety symptoms, apathy, obsessive compulsive disorder, and irritability. So as far as speech and language problems that you can develop because of Huntington's disease, there are quite a few that you can actually develop and that can arise in somebody. So they can experience hyperkinetic dysarthria, and some of those symptoms are distortions of vowels and consonants, mistiming in breath control, inappropriate pausing in phrases, hoarseness of voice, and variability of volume control. And hyperkinetic dysarthria is due to lesions in basal ganglia, which was one of those areas of the brain that was affected by those mutated proteins and such. So in early stages of the disease, it's better to get an early referral to an SLP. Better to start off early with some of the treatment. Someone may experience mild dysarthria symptoms, and it's helpful to learn self-awareness and monitoring techniques of speech. They may have difficulties processing complex information. For mid stages, they may experience cognitive changes, memory loss, language comprehension, and expression problems. They also may have social isolation. Late stages in the disease, your natural speech may be unintelligible, but you may still have intact comprehension. They'll have severe motor defects, and that can affect your writing, typing, and if you're using an AAC system, you may experience cognitive decline and have some of those severe dysarthria symptoms. People also may experience apraxia of speech, and that can be characterized by inconsistent articulatory errors, groping oral movements. You may have many errors in your phrases, and you'll have increased errors as your words get longer and your phrases get longer. Also, incoordination of breathing and using your voice. There also can be language difficulties, so you can have latent responses to people. You may have difficulties finding words. You may use fewer words in utterances. You may have shorter utterances altogether, difficulties staying on topic, and problems with preservation through the whole conversation itself. So now we'll talk about the brain and areas of the brain that are affected. So like I said before, the two main areas are the basal ganglia and the cerebellum, but there are a few other areas that can be affected by Huntington's disease. So the basal ganglia, again, you'll have changes in the cannabinoid, dopamine, adenosine receptors that will occur in those with Huntington's disease. As far as the cerebellum goes, that might lead to some of the typical results of those in Huntington's disease. So again, the chorea, the dysarthria, the incoordination, things like that. And then other areas that might be affected are the medium spinal GABA erratic striatal projection neurons. They're very vulnerable with this disease. CA1 region of the hippocampus, the angular gyrus in the parietal lobe, chromosome 4, because the mutations of CAG repeat are on exon 1 of chromosome 4. So that's those long repetitions of CAG repeat. Right, so what are some of those symptoms that can occur with Huntington's disease? So physical symptoms that can occur are chorea, which is again involuntary muscle movement or jerking. You can have dystonia, which is the uncontrollable muscle contractions. Your movements may be very rigid. You could have bradykinesia. You could have walking problems and lack of flexibility. For mental symptoms, you have planning and organizing problems, temper outburst, difficulty learning new material. You may be very impulsive with making decisions, and you can also have quite a bit memory loss. And then some behavioral symptoms, you have aggression, poor judgment, lack of initiative, irritability, again with those temper outbursts, depression and anxiety symptoms, dysphoria, euphoria, and you also can have sleep disturbances. All right, so how can one get Huntington's disease? So first, it is a hereditary disorder. So if your parents have Huntington's disease, it's a good chance that the child will develop the symptoms for the disease. If you have, like I said earlier, that 36 to 39 repetitions of CAG repeat, you'll have an increased risk for passing on the disease to your future children. And there's only 8% of patients don't have a known family member with the disease. So 92% of patients with Huntington's disease have a known family member who also has Huntington's disease. So it's a good chance if you or someone in your family has Huntington's disease that your children or future people in your family will develop this disease as well. Again, with the CAG repeat, if there's long repetitions of that, 40 plus repetitions within the HTT gene, there's a good chance you'll develop the disease because that produces long versions of Huntington protein that binds onto the neurons and that causes the neurons to ultimately die. Also, mutations in Huntington protein and in HTT gene on chromosome 4, particularly because that's where the CAG repeat mutations are on axon 1 of that, and they provide instructions for making the Huntington protein. So some quick facts about Huntington's disease. In numbers, for occurrence, it occurs every 3 to 7 people out of 100,000 people, and it can occur to anyone ages 1 through 80 years old. So you can develop symptoms as a child and have juvenile Huntington's disease. It's less common, and then those diseases can get worse as time goes on. Typically, people will start developing symptoms around their 40s or 50s. And then this disease is dominant in white people of European ancestry. It's less prevalent in those of Asian and African ancestry. And last but not least, here are all my sources that I used to gather my information to make this video. I hope you enjoyed it. It was a lot of fun researching this disease and finding out what exactly causes it because I haven't heard of it before I read the book that I was reading. So thanks for listening to the whole thing. I'm sorry for all the mistakes I made talking.